Hi, everybody. My name is Jesse Knutson. I'm a professor of Sanskrit language and literature, and I have the pleasure and honor today of introducing an old friend and cherished comrade by the name of Viren Murthy, who's going to give us a really exciting talk, if the previous talks that I've seen of his are any indication. Um, Viren is someone who's addicted to learning new things. Though he was trained as a specialist in Chinese and Japanese literature, he has long expanded as a true Pan-Asianist. He's studying Kannada language, he's studying Carnatic music. He's virtually addicted to learning new things, which I guess isn't such a bad thing. Um, and part of the way that works is that he's incredibly brilliant and also incredibly humble. So I'm going to be the one to list his achievements as a result. Um, so Viren's a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Um, a longstanding intellectual interest of Viren's has been what he calls the Back to the Future narrative, um, in which the past itself provides the path to the future in some more utopian form, a future in which we can realize potentials from the past and even excluded potentials from the past. So that fundamental way of framing the thought of the future, and each of his books touches on this theme. So his first book came out in 2011. It's called The Political Philosophy of Zhang Tian. That's my best attempt at pronouncing that. The Political Philosophy of Zhang Tian, The Resistance of Consciousness. In this book, he explored how this figure drew on Yogacara, consciousness-only Buddhism, to craft a theory of revolution. So again, and in the context of China's ongoing incorporation into the global system of nation states and capitalism. Um, his second book, The Politics of Time in China and Japan, Back to the Future, brings together essays on precisely this theme, exploring how Chinese and Japanese intellectuals mobilized traditional texts to create a more utopian future. These intellectuals were, of course, nationalists, but unlike in England and the United States, this nationalism is connected to anti-imperialism and resistance to global inequality, as Viren teaches us. Um, he also proposes that a comparable inequality might divide Europe, inviting comparisons between Germany and Asian nations, all of which saw themselves to be marginalized around the same time. Um, his third monograph, Pan-Asianism and the Legacy of the Chinese Revolution, shows how intellectuals in China and Japan promoted unity among poor Asian nations to resist Western domination. Important to this project was the critique of Eurocentrism, such as Hegel's understanding that what does he say? The sun of history rises in the East and sets in the West, that the East needs the West. But simultaneously, these figures were appropriating Hegel's critique of abstract individualism. So the legacy of Pan-Asianism is complex, and Viren is a scholar perfectly adequate to it, defying or eliding, however you want to think of it, boundaries between a putative West and East, completely annihilated in Viren's work, so don't get used to those ideas. Viren treats these complex topics with an exceptional clarity, and it's really going to be a pleasure to listen to him. Today, his talk is entitled Rethinking Tradition and Modernity, Reflections on Romantic Anti-Capitalism. Mahalo, Viren. Thank you for being here. And in fact, thank you for existing.
Thank you. Thank you. Mahalo nui. That was a great introduction. So great, in fact, that I almost wonder if I have anything to say now, because you've said it all. But I'm going to try to say something in any case. So let me also try to share my screen here. Here we go. at the bottom here, right? Okay. Share. Yes. And then can everyone see that? Okay, good. So I'm going to be talking about romantic anti-capitalism, and so I'm going to in various places I'm going to try to connect it to the themes of the conference. And how long do I have? Could you remind me again, Jesse? What is that? I can't hear.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was muted. Nanda, can you help with that? How long does he have to speak?
Because I can put a timer or something.
Like 45 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I'll put a little timer here just so I. Okay. Yes. So I'll get right to it. So I've got a couple of sections. I'll try to go through them quickly. So I have an overarching argument, a kind of introduction, and I want to connect the romantic to the common, and that's going to be the way I'm going to. But I'll also, of course, connect it to other things, and then I'll have a quick discussion of Marx and different types of Marxism. What one I'll call, value theory, die neue Marxlektur, and then of course another reading of Marx, which I think will be more sympathetic to indigenous movements, and those would be the romantic tendencies. And towards the end, I'm going to give a brief example. I think Jesse mentioned I have this interest in sort of Kannada and Tamil, and especially radical sort of Tamil Marxism. And so I'll draw a little bit on that at the end. Okay, so first introduction. So I'm going to defend what some people call romantic anti-capitalism. And I'm going to explain this in a moment. So the point is somewhat simple. So compared to, we've had a lot of very complex and detailed presentations. Mine is actually fairly simple. And the point is that one might draw on elements of the past or tradition to confront the problems of capitalism. And this, of course, you're going to see immediately connects to what we heard this morning and yesterday and so on. But as one investigates this fairly simple claim, we will see that it entails more involved points about time, history, and the nature of capitalism. So Jesse already mentioned these books, so I'm not going to talk about them too much, but I can just mention it, a little bit of shameless advertising here. But the subtitle of the book, as Jesse also mentioned, could be connected to the problem of commons, which brings us to the temporality of the commons, right? And I think that came up in Prem's talk, right? So the panel yesterday, Sharwari and Tammy and Noel, right, was talking about two types of history, which kept coming back. There's continuity and a break. This also returned with Prem's talks about Ambedkar. Again, there's a break, right, in his vision. Now, if there's a total break, the romantic vision doesn't quite work, is one of the points, right? So we need to go, in my opinion, beyond a simple opposition between the conservative, which is the continuation going back, and the radical, and realize that those who argue that we need to return to the tradition actually have a vision of the future. Now, the question, of course, is how we link the past and the future. So consequently, I contend that the romantic anti-capitalists propose Back to the Future narrative. So in some sense, I'm repeating, drawing on some earlier work. Consequently, when assessing conservative thought, right, and this is various types, we see them all over the world today, we need to grasp what exactly is being conserved. So the other publication that Jesse already mentioned, in that book, I talk about Pan-Asianists, whether in India, China, or Japan, and I claim that they develop Back to the Future narratives. So I show how Asia moves from being geography to becoming an idea or ideal, right? And that's one of the issues I think is very important today. And we have another session after this, where I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I'll mention this. I have a hunch without knowing much about this. But I think that Hawaii is also more than geography, right? I think that's in the panels I've been hearing about Hawaii. It has been, in some sense, more than just geography. So what links all of these movements is romantic anti-capitalism. And I didn't deal with this extensively, which is why I'm happy to have this opportunity to deal with it now. So first, what is the romantic in romantic anti-capitalism? So to begin my discussion of the romantic in romantic anti-capitalism, so let's first focus on this term. So the term obviously has meanings beyond academia. And so if we just ask people on the street, and this is when I talk to people, friends outside of academia or relatives, and I say, well, I'm interested in romantic anti-capitalism or something like that, they immediately think of such images that come to mind, right? It's all over films. And in this case, it's about love, right? Remember that I think it's Anusha's question through TMK was, can one love, right? But what does that actually mean, right? So love as a feeling might be considered the opposite of reason. And this is true with respect to something like, the Frankfurt School, right? What they call instrumental reason, right? A rationality that is connected to self-interest. Returning to cinema, there's also the anti-love that is expressed in a character of the following film. And this is Bogan. Some of you may have seen it. It's the Tamil film of 2017 with Arvind Swamy. I'm going to do something unusual, and this may backfire, but I'm actually going to try to show a clip. Let's see, let me try this. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Can everyone see this?
Yes.
Yes?
Are you screening?
Can you see it? Can you hear it?
No, we can't hear anything.
You can't hear anything. Okay, that's a problem. Okay, how does that? It doesn't matter. I'm not someone who's. Oh, maybe I have to stop sharing PowerPoint. Is that? And then how does this work? Can you still see it?
You switch to another screen which has the
video. Okay. Forget it then. Then I'm gonna stick to. If it's that complex, I thought it was simpler. Okay. Can you now? Let's see. Sorry about this. How do I? So can I now? I can share the screen again, right?
Yeah, you're seeing the screen.
Okay, you're seeing.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me get back to this then. I'm not really okay, now how do I go back to presenting?
The slideshow.
Okay, good. Okay, I'll just go back to. Sorry about that brief. Okay, so anyway, this is a film where I see that opening title song as actually the anti-love. So it's the anti-romantic, and so I'm going to do a reading of the song a little bit. So basically, when they introduce the sort of the villain, whose name is Bogan, he makes the following statements, right? He says, love is a waste of time. Lust is the only renunciation. Affection and fondness are false relations. One must go beyond these and walk the earth, right? So if I hook up with someone in the evening, it's foolish to remember me through her jewelry or beauty, and smell. Bogan is her name. So here, what I look at this is as the anti-love. It's actually right because it's saying, and lust is renunciation. There's a lot we can discuss about that, but I won't go into it. So then he goes on, and I think that this is, in some sense, in a dialogue with tradition, right? So love, knowledge, and qualities are obedient donkeys, are of no use. In a land without love, right? So there's no need for headache tablets. It is foolish to look back at the price of things that one has just bought. Bogan says that all goods one sees is mine. So towards the end, I think this is a gesture towards capitalism. And here I think that this is almost the opposite of what we find in the Tirukkural, which a lot of Marxists draw on, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And so this is where I think you have the anti-love. So it's almost like the love versus anti-love in that film. So the above discussion is focused only on interpersonal love and its opposite. But the term romantic, such as in the Romantic movement, of course, includes other things such as romantic poetry and so on. So let's look at this for a moment. The Romantic movement could be considered a larger response to the Enlightenment and as an attack on the unique focus on reason. So first, let's list some of the Enlightenment thinkers one might have in mind in philosophy who are associated with, something like rationality and so on. So René Descartes, of course, Voltaire, Spinoza, perhaps, definitely rationalism, whether he's Enlightenment, some people say Dutch Enlightenment, and so on. Kant, Hegel, maybe, and I'll come back to him. But what they have in common is an attempt to grasp the nature of reality through reason. The Romantic, on the other hand, would move beyond the rational. We, of course, see this in literature. So let's take, for example, Wordsworth, right? Very famous, one impulse from the vernal wood, may teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good than all the sages can. Sweet is the lore which nature brings. Our meddling intellect misshapes the beauteous forms of things. We murder to dissect. So here again, the key is the impulse versus, the kind of rational thinking that the sages can give you, right? So here we get the Romantic as something that goes beyond the rational. So the Romantics are often thought of as going against the Enlightenment rationalists. And I put question marks around Hegel because he expresses both sides of the opposition. His Romantic tendency is expressed in a distinction between reason and understanding, which is why some people would say Hegel is actually a Romantic thinker, right? And we see this in the following, right? If you look at his logic, right? The understanding, Verstand, determines and holds the determinations fixed. Reason is the negative and dialectical, since it dissolves the determinations of the understanding into nothing. It is positive since it generates the universal and comprehends the particular therein. So what we see here is that reason is precisely that which does not dissect for Hegel, which is why it's actually going to be connected to love in a certain way. So all of this suggests that the truth of Romanticism might incorporate its rational or other, or rather the rational might be able to incorporate. The Romanticism might be a moment of the rational. To bring this section to a close, I'd like to complete the circle and connect the two sides of Romanticism. On the one hand, romantic love, and on the other hand, the critique of reason. Here again, we might find Hegel expressing a romantic moment. So this time I'm going to cite from the philosophy of right, where Hegel speaks about the family and its root in love. So here again, a very famous passage, and this passage has been highlighted by Partha Chatterjee in his response to Charles Taylor in an interesting article in Public Culture, where he connects this passage to a kind of anti-colonialism. But notice here, and I'm just going to read the bold sections to save time. So love means in general the consciousness of my unity with another, so that I am not isolated on my own, für mich, but gain my self-consciousness only through the renunciation of my independent existence with another and of the other with me. So here the key is this going beyond the self, right? So which is why you're not the abstract individual that we associate with Western modernity and so on, right? The first moment is love that I do not wish to be an independent, in love is that I do not wish to be an independent person in my own right, and that if I were, I would feel deficient and incomplete. The second moment is that I find myself in another person, that I gain recognition in this person, who in turn gains recognition in me. Love is therefore the most immense contradiction, and the understanding cannot resolve it. So why can't the understanding resolve it? Because for Hegel, Verstand is precisely that which separates, right? So this, I think, is going to be a key moment in a lot of Romanticism. And notice that it is, in some sense, going to be the root of the Commons, right? which is why we have this this kind of movement against the breaking apart, right? So, but at this point, we might ask, what does any of this have to do with capitalism? We already get a hint of the response in the previous passage when we think of how Hegel defines love in opposition to the individual who does not see him or herself in the other, the self-interested individual, right? And that is Hegel's whole critique of civil society, which also came up in the previous panel. So the literary critic Michael Levy made the following remark that is relevant to our discussion. He says, Romanticism represents a critique of modernity, that is, of modern capitalist civilization, in the name of values and ideals drawn from the past, right? And Levy is kind of interesting, is an interesting kind of philosopher because or theorist, because he's also interested in kind of rescuing a kind of romanticism. So, however, the tensions between romanticism and capitalism goes deeper. And to understand this, let's now move from Hegel to Marx. My turn to Marx will not be to understand his work as a theory of class society, which is of course important, but to outline resources in his analysis which could help us understand aspects of modernity. So, summary of section 2. Romanticism refers to a striving for wholeness and well-being that has been fragmented by capitalist modernity. Consequently, we can understand its significance only by studying capitalism. So now capitalism and Marxism, as we'll see that I'm going to at least talk about two types. So to grasp the importance of Marx's work for a theory of modernity, let us begin with the first sentence of Das Kapital. The sentence is especially important given that we have repeatedly mentioned commodification in this symposium. From the beginning, think about Beamer's talk and so on. Right. So it starts, the very first line, most of you know it, but it's worth reading. The wealth of societies in the wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities. The individual commodity appears as its elementary form. Our investigation, therefore, begins with the analysis of the commodity. So the key here is to understand what he calls the cell form of capitalism. Now, one of the key points to Marxist theory is of course, the commodity. It is important to note that previous societies all over the world, the wealth of societies did not appear as commodities, but in other forms. And that's going to be that's why when you have the commodification of a pre-capitalist society, then you get a radical transformation of that society. So what is a commodity? The commodity, he says, is first of all an external object, a thing which through its qualities satisfies human needs of whatever kind. The nature of these needs, whether they arise, for example, from the stomach or imagination, make no difference, right? So this is trying to get into the two sides of the value form. From the above passage, we know that the commodity is something that satisfies the needs. There is no commodity that does not do this. But there are also those things that satisfy needs that are not commodities. We will return to this when we talk about use values that are not values. There might even be a struggle to keep these things not commodified, right? And that is sort of what's happening with things like water and so on, right? So he also says commodities are bearers, right? Träger of exchange value. But notice already a distinction between use value and exchange value. Use value is intimately connected with the actual material for the thing. But exchange value is something that the thing bears or carries. It is separate from the thing, or at least separable. Here, there is use value in every society, but we experience this use value in a particular form in capitalist society, namely the commodity form. And this is from Michael Heinrich's analysis. So we come to the problem of what makes exchange possible. We see people exchanging things every day, so what makes that possible? There must be some common element that allows them to compare them. In other words, Marx is going towards saying that exchange value is not merely a quantitative relationship, but a form of appearance of some particular common thing. It is, of course, also a quantitative relationship, right? Because once we talk about price. So notice that the common element cannot be material, since this will be linked to use and not all pervasive. We are exchanging precisely in order to gain use values. It cannot be connected to sensuous quality of a particular thing, because that would be too specific. All the commodities, sensuous commodities, are extinguished at the exchange value, right? It's no longer a table, a house, and that's what he says, right? On the other hand, it's not the particular labor of the joiner or the weaver or the tailor, right, etc. He also says, right? So on the one hand, the root of exchange value is abstract labor, which in turn will measure value. So there's a double abstraction from the useful thing and useful labor. It is almost as if one goes into history and then sees things that are all made of a kind of general type of labor that is exchangeable. But now here another factor comes in, namely time. So the measure of value is going to be determined in the labor time, right? Socially necessary labor time, I should say, congealed in the product. So what remains after you abstract all the use value, right? So it's not a computer, it's not a phone or anything. And he says it's labor. He says, now let us look at the residue of the products of labor. There's nothing left of them in each case but the same phantom-like objectivity, right? Famous line, gespenstige Gegenständlichkeit. They are merely congealed quantities of human labor, right? i.e. of human labor expended without regard to the form of expenditure. And yeah, so there's also some issues about translation, right? It's literally a mere jelly, right? A glow. What is it? A bloße Gelehrte. So to make this simple, we can use the following diagram, right? So you have use value, which is value or material wealth, right? And then you have value, which is abstract, right? So you get which we experience in the form of price, right? So we go to the store, and we see all these different things, and they have different prices, which is a quantitative relationship. But the actual thing, of course, might sort of serve different needs, right? Very concretely, right? Okay, so again, it's the same labor, right? It's also the same labor that is, so labor, so we have an abstraction on both sides, right? Abstract labor, and then, the abstraction from the thing itself, right? So to put this in another, right, we can think about the labor as the social substance, right? Whether it's tailoring, carpentry, it's all going to be the same kind of abstraction. And similarly, the prices are again going to be similarly abstract, right? So I don't want to go too much in detail into Marx's analysis, but we'll look at some of the implications of this for a theory of modernity, right? And this is where I'm trying to say that Marx is not just an economic theory. So one of the tragedies of Marxist theory is precisely that he's seen as an economic theory. So the Marxist, anti-Marxist debate hinge on how important the economy is. Oh, so you're a Marxist, so you must think the economy is everything. Well, sort of, but not quite, right? However, since Lukács, right, and history is his consciousness, there has been an attempt to see the commodity form not merely as about economics, but a form that affects the whole of society. In this manner, one connects the commodity, right? And so with that abstract relation we were just talking about, to larger tendencies in society. From this perspective, capitalism is not just about exploitation, but about larger tendencies such as homogenization, right? Homogenization is also a form of capitalism, right? So that in a sense that, that's the commodity form sort of homogenizes as we've seen, because it abstracts from the concrete particular. Similarly, calculation or calculative thinking, your readers of Heidegger might immediately think about the relationship between his work and capitalism. Now, a critique, but of course, the thing is that Marx is not a romantic anti-capitalist in a simple sense, right? Because there is the whole Marxist critique of romantic anti-capitalism. And to some extent, we saw elements of that in the previous panel, especially in Prem's reading of Ambedkar. So even among the Marxists who emphasize this overarching view of capitalism as grounding modernity and who see modernity as a problem, romantic romantic anti-capitalism is there should be anti-capitalism there. Romantic anti-capitalism is a solution that is usually worse than the problem. We see this also in Lukács, who contends that despite his own romantic tendencies, that romanticism overlooks the importance of class. Perhaps more importantly, romanticism is connected to fetishism. We see this in the more recent critique of romantic anti-capitalism by Mosh Postone. Put simply, in Postone's view, the Nazis were romantic anti-capitalists, and they identified the Jews with the abstract side of capitalism or money. He would add that something similar occurred with the Japanese in the interwar period. But here's some evidence for his analysis, right? That the Jews here are associated with the abstract side of capitalism, and so when the Nazis are attacking a lot of the problems of capitalism, they look at that as congealed in the Jew, and so that accounts for the move to totally exterminate them, right? So this would be a case in which the romantic anti-capitalism ends up producing something much worse, right, which is fascism. So in that case, how do we go beyond capitalism on the perspective of the Neue Marxlektüre, which Postone is a part of, right? So there's a kind of symbiosis there, I think, between the two, and we can talk about that in the discussion. So let's now first examine their solution. So the list of effects of capitalist modernity is endless, but I'm going to jump to the problem of technology and mechanization because it brings us to a major contention concerning how to overcome capitalism. So this is the simple way of putting it, right? So that basically with capitalism and the production of relative surplus value, because you need to produce more and more in a given amount of time, what happens is that you start, that real labor becomes replaced by dead labor or machines, right? So you get increasing mechanization, which could lead to increasing unemployment, but it also leads to the possibility of a different society in which we can control machines together. So this is where proletarian labor or value becomes obsolete, right? So capitalism and Marx, this reading of Marx, which actually is also there in Negri, Antonio Negri's 70s books, I think it's Marx Beyond Marx. And what he's he's drawing on this passage and others where he wants to say capital itself is this is Marx in the Grundrisse. Capital itself is the moving contradiction in that it presses to reduce labor time to a minimum while it posits labor time on the other side as the sole measure and source of wealth. Now, I'm not going to get into Marxologist problems with this passage because there's some Marxists, who would say, wait a second, why is he using wealth there? It should be the source of value. But in any case, let me explain the basic idea here, right? So the idea is that capitalism, on the one hand, says it makes labor increasingly obsolete, right? So because it constantly includes, especially today with AI, that's a big fear, right? That labor is going to be obsolete. But why is that? Why is that a fear? Well, it's a fear because in capitalist society, the only way to get use values is to sell your labor power. So if you're unemployed, you don't have the means to get use value. So capitalism sort of simultaneously cuts in these two different directions. Now, the only way to overcome this, according to this reading of Marx, is precisely to overcome the capitalist society and reorganize production so that then the reduction of labor time should actually be a good thing. Because given that proletarian labor is still the foundation of capitalist production, what this leads to is unemployment, right? Because capital cannot absorb the labor that it needs to. But the other version is to put it schematically this, right? Where now the work is instead of dead labor crushing living labor, we actually can organize living labor, or rather dead labor. So now this of course is the utopia, but realize that this utopia is not the romantic form of utopia insofar as the romanticization of tradition. Some might say it's a different form of romanticism, but that's another story. Okay, so following the new Marx lecture, we can connect the core aspects of modernity, including homogenization, to the commodity form. Marx's analysis of capitalism is not merely economic. Romantic anti-capitalism could lead to fascism. So these are the points. This reading of Marx also leads to a vision of the transition to socialism that stresses technology. So now back to romantic anti-capitalism. So Postone and other Marxists, the point, of course, are valid. However, my point is simply, although the Nazis were a form of romantic anti-capitalism, not all romantic anti-capitalism can be reduced to Nazism. One might even say that romantic anti-capitalism is potentially dangerous when it forgets or becomes disconnected from concrete issues of class and labor. There are moments of romantic anti-capitalist tendencies in Marx himself, right? Such as the Zasulich letters, right? Where he writes to the populist and says that, well, wait a second, in one of his drafts, right? There's a lot that's been said that he sends a very short version of the letter. But one of the drafts says, oh no, the Russian populists can draw on, kind of pre-capitalist tendencies that are there in Russia. So, is the technological perspective desirable, even if it were true, right? Is that the kind of society that we would like to live in, right? Where machines are doing everything. So this is the end of capitalism and proletariat. Is this what we're thinking of, right? Where they're not really laboring. So now let's think about the romantic elements in Marxism. And so here, the problem of colonial difference and formal subsumption come in. So scholars such as Harry Haroutunian and Massimiliano Tomba have focused on what Marx calls formal subsumption, namely that capital does not subsume all practices, and these resilient practices could form the beginning of a post-capitalist future. This is what we might call a politics of the past. Now, in India, of course, Gandhi could be an example of this kind of romantic anti-capitalism, right? Very clearly saying, we don't need even all this industrialization and so on. What we have to do is go back to other forms of labor. Now, I'm going to look at Tamil Marxism before I end. I think I have a few more minutes. And look at how they also express a form of romantic anti-capitalism, but based on kind of textual work. And I'm going to focus on Kovai. And he writes in the preface to one of his books, actually a book on the Tirukural, and he says, in early history, there was no private property and people were one with nature. People worked for what they needed. There was no space in their lives for social competition, jealousy, and conceit. Now, this, interestingly, is what he thinks is what the Tirukural and a lot of Sangam literature is actually going against. So he's actually seeing the switch happening very early. But when I look at this, I immediately think of romantic anti-capitalism, because this is clearly a kind of reading of the past as kind of the opposite of capitalism. This, of course, we see also in various popular culture as well, like the recent film, I think it's 2015, but which is about actually a communist and the idea of the commons, right? Porambok being a kind of common, and the common is kind of communism, right? Poduvudai. But one might say that this romantic conception of the Tamil Dravidian, and this is a romantic conception of the Tamil Dravidian past, right? A kind of projection. However, the point is that it's being used specifically to resist capitalism. Although there may have been many problems associated with pre-capitalist society, Gnani attempts to recover a period where subject and object, and by extension, being and knowing, are not separate. Now here, of course, the links to the Hawaiian conception might be worth discussing. This then makes a classical text such as the Tirukural significant as a node of resistance. And here again, this will be selective drawing from a fairly complex text. So the idea of being and knowing not being separate brings us back to Hegel's idea of love. Note that this was also a space where subject and object, or self and other, were not separate. Moreover, the understanding couldn't resolve these contradictions because the understanding always separates. However, as Marxists would always point out, pre-modern societies are always connected to caste and other hierarchical oppressions, including gender. So the strategy of Marxist romantic anti-capitalist is just twofold. On the one hand, to show that subjectivity exists in classical Tamil texts, to show that they combat pre-modern hierarchies, and then to show that these texts also overcome individual subjectivity. So this is why the moment of subjectivity is really important, because otherwise it seems just like a pre-modern kind of hierarchical society. But he wants to say, no, there's the subjectivity. And so they're attempting to find both. So the classical texts express both modernity and its romantic overcoming. So the Tirukkural is a great resource, right? It's a kind of 3rd century text that is being drawn on here, because it consists of couplets that are disjointed and open to different reconstruction. So I'm just going to list 3 that show the affirmation of subjectivity, its overcoming, or sublation and equality, which are often drawn by Marxists. So there's this famous kural, right? Devatan aga the eninum muirchitan muvat kulitarum. So this is that even though the gods might be against something, the effort will reap the appropriate rewards, right? So the effort here is that you can go even against the gods, right? So this is why Marxists like it, because you're going beyond the gods too, right? So this you can go against God or fate, right? But the overcoming of subjectivity is often connected with renunciation, gesturing towards the communal, which is a recurring theme. So this is another famous kurul, right, which is Yan enudu enuseru karupan vanorku ulagapugum. So here the feelings of I and mine are not, but vanity and pride. He who crusheth them entereth a higher world of the gods. And so this is again going beyond the gods, and the idea of the self and this kind of and possession, right, is going against that. The other one is all living things are one in the circumstances of birth. Diversity of work gives each its special worth, right? Right. So putting these various tendencies, right, subjective effort, labor, equality, and the overcoming of individuality together, we get the idea of laboring not only for oneself, but for the larger community, the not I, which of course is the key theme in Marxism. From this perspective, sharing and communal living are inextricably linked to production. However, if all we had were text, we would be reinscribing difference between knowledge and practice. Moreover, the ideas expressed would be merely utopian ideals. The crucial step in making romantic anti-capitalism viable concerns a theory of history in which past ideals and practices do not just pass, but return within the present. And this, again, this is what definitely connects to the previous panel and also other verses. So the whole problem of whether we're talking about a break. I think romantic anti-capitalism has to say that no, the past returns. There's some kind of a continuity. This work is done by another Tamil Marxist named N. Muthumohan, and his reading of the Asiatic mode of production. So without going to the details, he contends that in colonial capitalist Indian society, it is a fact that inherited foundations changed. However, the Asiatic mode of production, which remember for Marx was a bad thing, right, which was stagnant and so on, has survived, and it reveals itself by influencing identity politics, right? So he talks about the Asya Urpatti Murai, right, which is the Asiatic mode of production that keeps coming back. And the whole book is really about how Marxists should draw on identity politics, right? Now, although Marx contended that the Asiatic mode of production represented something outmoded, for Muthumohan, it's really the commons, right? It's the communal labor. But where do we look for such incompletely subsumed spaces and times and practices? Clearly, one could say that existing labor practices around the world and in India in particular is where we would look, but can we find them? perhaps places where you have handicrafts, not given way to mechanization rather, and communal ideals of labor survive. Are those remnants of the communal and pre-capitalists? I mean, this is of course what contemporary Gandhians would also say, right? Talking about handicrafts, weaving, and so on. So now, a summary of section 4. We saw that Marxists have a critique of romantic anti-capitalism, namely that it could lead to fascism, and at its best, it's useless. Namely that it's okay, we're reading some texts, but they're not actually doing anything. However, we've seen Marxists on the periphery of capitalist world systems, such as in Tamil Marxists, attempt to argue against this. I argue that this overlaps with the current trend towards formal subsumption in Marx. Now, can we find such practices in our contemporary world? To the extent that our practices and relations are not completely subsumed by capitalism, this should be a possibility. So now I'm going to conclude, and I think I have a little time. Okay, so if we establish that there are certain remnants of earlier practices, what some might call resilient forms of pre-modern labor, the next question is, what is to be done? We have seen that throughout the 20th century and the 21st centuries, various forms of resistance from communities on the margins. So here is what we saw in the first day. Is this an example, right? With the Hawaiian alternatives that we saw in Beamer's talk. We can come back to this in the next discussion. But perhaps the most famous of such movements today are those, we can think about Latin America with the Zapatistas and Chiapas, right? And including numerous movements of indigenous people. So this is where the indigenous movement, decolonial sort of movements, right? And decolonialism as a theoretical movement often draws on the indigenous, has to somehow come together with Marxism. Now, the hope for romantic anti-capitalism would be that broader connections between various movements around the world are formed. These would then have to connect with other movements against capitalism, including and especially those based on class. So the problem is that if we just have the movement based on indigeneity, I think the problem of dwindling in or turning into a kind of fascism, that danger is much greater. So we could say maybe handloom weaving might be another one, and so on. Okay, so I'm not gonna go into that, but I think I'll just end here. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Viren. That was such a powerful talk. I really appreciate that. I'm sure everyone else does, and I'm sure there are a lot of questions. Let me just take the prerogative of asking one quick question first. And there was the line about if we only had texts, utopian representations, but I would, and on behalf of Mekula, I'm also saying this, a fellow pre-modernist, in ancient India, early medieval India, often we have these texts that are fully idealized and then evidence that people were making those texts material, that they were trying to live up to them. And so it's constantly like based on superstructure, switching places in that pre-modern context. I guess I just wonder what you would think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't at the time I said that, I wasn't thinking about the pre-modern context exclusively. But I think with respect to the pre-modern context, yeah, I think what you're saying already is you're going beyond just the text, right? Because you're talking about the text and how it's being used. And that, of course, requires, I'm not a pre-modernist, so I can sort of read what people today are saying about a text. But then they're using the text for the present. They're almost saying, okay, well, the pre-Sangam time was a great time and everything. And I have my doubts about that. But what I'm interested in, of course, is saying, but this is very interesting that it's actually being looked at as something socialist. But then what you have to somehow do is say, but wait a second, that thing that goes all the way back is somehow coming here, right? It's somehow relevant to us, right? And that's the moment where I think it becomes interesting.
Yeah, things come full circle. Touche. That was a really
Thanks.
good answer. You're right. We are thinking about material things, but we're always stuck in text, though. The material things that Mekula and I deal with are coins with text on them. They're pieces of metal or stone with text on them.
Yes, yes. And if we have a very broad idea of text, of course, il n'y a pas d'hors
Yeah,
texte, right?
right.
So we have we're in text all the time. But then, do we have to make distinctions between types of texts? I guess is the next question.
Types of intertextuality, maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I don't want to monopolize, and we got a lot of hands up. I'm going to go left to right. Shankar, you can unmute yourself. Hi,
Yes.
Shankar.
Hi, Jesse. Hi, Viren. Thank you for this presentation. I guess I jumped to I put my hand up right away because in a way I want to re-ask my question about Ambedkar and the observation about not just division of labor but division of laborers, which I feel is like even more aptly posed to you. And maybe I can just kind of fill in a little bit. I think what Ambedkar is trying to, and I kind of have thought about that, over time, and I'm kind of coming to the conclusion now more recently, especially in the context of reading something like the Buddha and his Dharma, his late, posthumous work, which I think answers the question of, in a way, if Prem were here, I would kind of ask him to kind of maybe think about qualifying his argument, because in the Buddha and his Dharma, Ambedkar, gives a different origin story for Gautam Siddharth, which is not the usual origin story of, Gautam kind of leaving the palace and then encountering all these sufferings and then making the choice of enlightenment. But as many critics have pointed out, that for Ambedkar, the key moment for Siddharth's entering the path of enlightenment is in fact a crisis over water in the republic in which he's living. And there's a debate about whether they should go to war or not. And Buddha belongs to Gautam Siddhartha at that time belongs to the camp, which says that, no, we shouldn't go to. So it's a very different origin story. It's not individualistic. It is not a spiritualist. It's very much a kind of a social, which I think informs Ambedkar's thinking throughout. And I think, Ambedkar was thinking, even though he wrote about Buddhism very directly in his final years, but he was, of course, thinking about it throughout his life, even going back to his, early New York years, as we know. So I want to come back to the laborers rather than labor, because in a way, I think, and he's also, of course, dialoguing with Marxism. What I think I'm hearing him say it's the Foucault-Marx debate, right? I mean, I don't want to say Foucault because, the Buddha is not Foucault. I'm just saying this to sort of clarify my question. It's that I think what he's saying is that it's not just, if we focus on the value form, then history becomes a kind of an engine to which human beings are almost like, they're just kind of like embodiments and sort of articulations of the kind of the engine of history, which is this, progressing in a kind of a direction of that the value form takes. But he wants to reverse that, right? He wants to say we have to begin with the division of people. And yeah, I don't know if I'm coming through, and I kind of want to think about this, the problem that you're laying out in that context. So I think really kind of asking you to reflect on that kind of Ambedkar, kind of labor is not labor, but hopefully with the sort of context I've tried to provide. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question, and definitely what I was trying to think about in this talk, because and I think you will enjoy N. Muthumohan's book on Tamil identity politics, because he's very influenced by Ambedkar. And so the question about the division of labor versus the division of laborers is crucial here. And the question, of course, is how to go. So in some sense, my whole, I guess, hope, and I think it's Muthumohan's hope as well, is to sublate the Foucault-Marx opposition, right? So how do you sublate it? And to sublating that, because if you think about identity politics, it's really saying precisely that, wait a second, there's a division of laborers. So if you just stress class, you're going to overlook that. And that's precisely why he's starting with identity, right? That he's saying we've got to look at that identity. But I think Muthumohan's point is then, okay, well, what do we do after that? Because if we stop there, then we're sort of throwing away the baby with the bathwater, as they would say, right? So that's why what you then have to do is sort of retotalize. Somehow you've got to go from that identity, the division, within sort of labor, among laborers, to then reuniversalize, right? So that's going to be the point. And so that is where you somehow the big way in which you try to bring caste and caste together, class and caste together, right? So that's where for him in his context, then Tamil identity has to have something universal. I've made a similar argument about this in the Jewish context, in looking at Postone, right? So that's where you then have, because something that most people did not know about his work, and he doesn't write about it as much, is actually his interest in Jewish identity. But his attempt, his hope was always to connect Jewish identity to a larger kind of a different type of universality. And I think that's going to be, so it has to be a universality that does not obliterate the particular, right? And so that is where I think how I'm trying to sort of square the circle is if you will. Thanks.
All right, Mekula is up next.
Thank you, Viren. That was amazing. Lots to think about. I was just thinking about this idea of what you just said, that when we consider sort of conservative narratives, we need to consider what is being conserved. So my question actually is coming from my thinking, obsession almost with Hindutva as a historian of, the medieval world. And, feminists, and here I'm thinking of Uma Chakravarti's famous essay, What Happened to the Vedic Dasi, when she sort of makes the argument that within these kinds of romantic narratives of anti-colonial nationalism, liberal anti-colonial nationalism, the figure of the enslaved woman, the Vedic Dasi, disappears, right? So somebody like her or, V. Gita and others would say that, romantic anti-capitalism without class is fascism, but romantic anti-capitalism without caste and gender is also fascism. So I was just wondering, in any of these authors that you're sort of looking at, do they think about the question of gender, and if yes, how do they deal with it?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I definitely would agree with you that definitely it's not just class, but gender has to be brought in here. I have to look back and see where exactly, whether I know it's on their radar, but how great of a role it plays. Caste and class are definitely the main variables that they're talking about. But I would think the gender is also there, which is why, like in the Tamil tradition, someone like Ovayar is constantly brought back, right? Because they want to say, oh, look, we have this, woman thinker as well who's there, right? And who is also saying these things that could point in a progressive direction. So I think you're right, and I think that the danger is always there because these are totalizing visions. It's a holistic vision, right? And because of that, and that's why the deconstructionists, the post-structuralists are often that's often their target. They can attack that precisely because they say, oh, wait a second, if you have a totalizing vision, you're going to have exclusions. And it's often going to be the women or the lower caste that are going to be that are not only excluded but invisible. That exclusion itself is going to be invisible. So the strategy that I think that I see in romantic anti-capitalism at its best is precisely to sort of make those oppressions visible, but then to retotalize, not to then fragment, right? Because what can often happen is, oh, wait a second, the totalization doesn't work, and therefore we're not going to totalize. And my point is that that's doubly dangerous. it's dangerous, one, because you won't be able to understand the totalizing forces that are causing what's happening. But that some people will give you. But it's also dangerous because a vision of the future requires a retotalization, so that we can go beyond just the fragmentary identities of those people who are being oppressed and being excluded at this point, right? So that would be my answer.
Anna, you're up next.
Okay, thank you. My mind is spinning and trying to reformulate my question as we go on here, but I guess I'm thinking as you continue to articulate what you think things should be done, you come closer and closer to a Zapatista perspective, and which is one that I think is maybe more anarchistic. And I'm wondering what you think, or maybe you can put it in what Mutumogun thinks about the role of the state. And where I'm coming from is this question, this what is to be done question, this is one which for the last 30 years, everyone in Nepal, including myself, has lived through and made decisions about and struggled within the context of global capitalism to try and restructure a state along the lines of what is seen as more horizontal and egalitarian principles, and for various political reasons, and also those relating to capitalism and hierarchical caste rather than caste as ethnicity, which is what the Maoists were trying to see it in terms of. So it's been something that I think about and try and live every day. And I'm wondering how Mutumogan will contribute and what is the role of the state?
Okay, thank you very much. That actually reminds me also of the question I think that Ananya was asking in the previous panel as well, so the state has constantly been coming up, and it's a difficult question. I would want to say I didn't want to give the impression that I'm an anarchist, especially definitely not at the moment. But this is something that I dealt with in to a certain extent in my Jantayen book, because he was someone who, there was a part of him that, coming out of Buddhism and so on, there was a kind of anarchistic reading of some of the classical Chinese texts that he was doing. And what I noticed, though, is he never wanted to completely go there, because he says in a world of imperialism, if you just become anarchist, and I think this would be true for, I think, Mutumohan or Kovenyani, they would all sort of see this. There, it's a little more complicated because they're talking about a particular identity within India, and so the first question for them is, do we support separatism, or do we join the Indian state? And so that becomes another kind of issue. But I think the whole problem is that if you get rid of the state, well, then you're just going to have, imperialism coming right at your door, right? And so that you can't quite get rid of the state right now. And so then the very practical question. So this has always been the problem that I'm, sort of, people always say, well, I'm sort of the philosopher masquerading as something else. And so that the question is, how do you then get to, from the abstract ideal to the concrete, or the political practice as you're dealing with in Nepal. And so I think it has to be seen in terms of certain stages where you have, the state definitely necessary at this point, but will it be necessary in the future is a more difficult question, right? Or what kind of political organization could actually would actually be conducive to human flourishing, I think is the question, right? And those are two different kind of issues. One is because there's a very practical necessity of the state at this point, right? And I think that I think so. Therefore, then the reform of the state becomes very important, as you were saying, right? How do we then reconceive the state? Yeah. So I think I'll leave it. I'll leave it at that. But I know I haven't completely answered your question, but it's because it is a very difficult one.
Nandini.
Thank you, Viren. So I'm really bummed out that we couldn't watch that scene
The clip. Yeah, because then I'd be in trouble because you know more about films than I do. So
But anyways, so I was my question is related to what you privilege in the anti-romantic capitalism, like which past do you privilege? Because in the quote that you gave us from Kovai Gnani, he seems to be talking about some kind of primitive, kind of primordial wholeness and harmony that existed. Whereas when you invoke the Asiatic mode of production, for instance, or a kind of more medieval empire state-based structure with a kind of monarchy or kingship at it, here I'm again returning to Kojin Karatani, who in some ways, like his mode of exchange B, which is about, like in some ways he rehabilitates the Asiatic mode by suggesting that it was capable of kind of managing large populations, one. And the reason I'm kind of bringing a medievalist state into a particular form of past that one might be invoking is because between the romantic, as you quoted the Wordsworth poem, that always has a kernel of harmony or wholeness in it. Whereas the medievalist always has something antagonistic, like it's not one about wholeness. So I'm like wondering, like, isn't the anti-romantic umbrella term obfuscating which past we want to return to? Like, which is the past that is being channeled by the different formations of so-called anti-romantic capitalists? Sorry for making it such a messy question, but yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, I think, another difficult one, because I think you're right that with the Gnani quote, it's actually it is something like a primitive communism that actually the medieval, if we call post-Sangam medieval, or at least the transition to the medieval, is obliterating. And so he wants to say that then in that sense, the Tirukural is a political act to try and restore. So he's already in the 3rd century sort of developing a kind of Back to the Future narrative, right? And he's saying, and his couplets are actually pointing back to that past. I mean, so I think you're right that there is a wholeness, and I guess, but the problem, of course, is with all of these wholenesses, your concern then, and why you have a kind of, if I understood you correctly, a kind of more of a tendency towards affirming the medieval, is precisely because there seems to be an agonistic or there's some kind of tension in the wholeness. And I think that that's good, but the problem is going to be what kind of tension is there. So I don't think that harmony overlooks or necessarily excludes tension, right? That I think is the whole Hegelian point, right? That the whole point about his notion of the state is precisely that it entails contradiction within it, right? So that and that's why the discussion of love is interesting, is that you see yourself in the other without completely losing yourself, right? So that idea is what he thinks is there in the state, right? So that, which is why at the level of civil society, right, the individual emerges, right? And then it is then that becomes a necessary moment of the holism that comes later. So I think that I think is going to be the totality that the romantic has to try to look for, right? Because obviously the totality without any particularity is not is not is and that's your concern, that harmony could be something that has no antagonism, or it can't even deal with it, in which case it's going to suppress it or make it look invisible, right? And that obviously is not going to be the ideal of, to use Roy Basker's phrasing, right? A world in which the concrete singularity of each is the condition for the possibility of the flourishing of all, right? And vice versa, right? And I think that I think has to be the goal. And I think that's what these people are sort of positing in the back, right? Or trying to read in these texts or something like that, right? Does that sort of help? I mean, again, I can't say too much more about the medieval because of my lack of knowledge. So I'm not going to try to go there. But does that sort of?
Yes, yeah. But by medieval, like even you invoked Sangam
Yeah.
literature, and that's not technically medieval, but yet there is social antagonism in the poetry. So yeah, I think you've answered that, as long as it's not like a kind of binary opposition.
Exactly, or an exclusion or something like that, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Sharvari, you're up.
Thank you. I had a very simple question actually, Viren, which is in your kind of advocacy for romantic anti-capitalism and for the interlocutors you're speaking with and for, is there like a telos? Like, is there like a future? What is we understand there's an orientation to the past that has these complications that you're talking about. What is the orientation to future? Like, what's the goal? Is it synonymous with the way that we understand the Marxist future? It seems to me no, based on what you've said. So how do we figure that relationship?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and something I want to work on in the future. I mean, talk about working on the future in the future, but I think that is a very difficult question, because even if you say, well, is it a Marxist one? My initial answer is yes, but the problem then is, what is the Marxist future? But I think, yeah. So I guess all I'm doing these days is just rescuing different things. I know my former advisor Prasenjit Dwara wrote that book, Rescuing History from the Nation. And now I find myself rescuing all the things that he was criticizing, sort of, as he was rescuing history from the nation. And I think that so today I was talking a lot about the past, right? The romantic past that you rescue. But I think that what we really have to do, and this is what I would say is sort of a coming out of your question, is rescue telos again, right? Because I think that now when we see teleology, we think, oh, that's bad because it's talking about a direction, and there are all these people who are being left out of the telos, or they're being forced into the telos or something like that. But I think that without the telos, I think you're right. Where is all this going, right? I think that is going to be the question that comes up. And I think that the point, the telos, of course, the telos is precisely the universality that contains particularity, right? And that we've been seeing in all of these questions. But then the issue is, how does that look concretely? And that's a much more difficult question. Right? And how do we get there? Right? Those two are the questions of our age, right? Precisely, where we see all around the world certain forms, some with aspects of the romantic, but moving very much to the right. How do we then pose a response, even begin to have a movement that goes in the other direction? Right. I think that's so. The quick answer, of course, is that yes, there is a telos, and the telos is precisely, it is Marxist. But the question is, how do we understand that Marxist telos, right? How do we understand the future? And I think that's going to be that's where at some level it's going to be the totality that recognizes particularity, right? And that's going to obviously be too abstract for you, but is there something, is that okay? Yeah.
All right, Ananya.
Hi, thanks, Viren. This is so stimulating, and my head is sort of spinning. So I'm going to try to bring it back to something concrete as a way to think through the problem I want to ask you about, which is, it seems to me, if we're thinking about like identity and the particularity, right? Part of if we bring back the state, as Anna suggested we do, into thinking through this, the problem is that we're dealing with an ethnographic gaze of the state, right? Which demands certain types of identity, and individuates in a particular way that is not necessarily in any way generative of what you might call an Marxist tradition of anti-romantic capitalism, right? And so anti-capitalism. So how would we sort of contend concretely with this problem right now, and especially in terms of what then becomes available, right? Like, so I'm thinking about like in this case, you have these communists using the Tirukkural or going back to Sangam literature. But then, like, very concretely, like the community that I do field work with, the Kudumbis, like they had a bardic tradition of the Ramayana that was very, very particular, and they are doing everything possible. So, and I found the archival material that sort of has texts that are available to it, and they have no interest in reviving any of it for a very simple reason. They're trying to get reserved tribal status, and that past and those texts in no way invoke something that for them is a usable identity right now, right? And so what I mean about the sort of what mediates the availability of past texts and past in general for a production of this kind of romantic anti-capitalism is itself happening within this kind of context of the ethnographic gaze of the state.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think so. So the question, of course, is we really have to think about the ethnographic gaze of the state, and how we think of that. Now, my reference points maybe are going to be slightly different from yours. So I'm going to say something, and then we can sort of see whether that's getting to where you're going or not. So the place where I usually go for, say, the Marxist theory of the state, right? Because it is one of the lacks in Marx, right? We could say that, he talks about a lot of things, but he doesn't talk much about the state, right? Especially once you get to Capital, his mature works. So, but the one place where I do find myself constantly going back to is a very problematic text, which is on the Jewish question. Right? Because on the Jewish question, you do get a critique of the gaze of the state. And he says that the problem, and there he says the problem with the state is precisely that it sees everybody as an abstract citizen. Right? And so it by definition, that state itself does not account for particularity, because the very idea of the citizen does that. But on the other hand, the citizen, that's how it gets formal equality. So that it's always a double-edged sword. And so in our present moment, this goes back to Anna's question. That's why it's very difficult in our present moment, when we don't have an alternative, to just make a blanket critique of it, because it does give you that formal equality, which then gives people the kind of ability to then start rallying around identity within a particular framework. But I think when you're talking about tribal issues and the ethnographic gaze, there's another aspect that you're bringing up that is connected to identity, and that is group identities. Because group identities are usually not registered by the state, right? Because precisely because it's based on that kind of the individual citizen, the formal equality, which is then connected to the big community, right? Which of the nation state, right? So then the question becomes, yeah, I think what you're saying is right. Okay, so then what do you do as a tribe? What is usable? But now but what I heard from what you were saying is that it's not usable. So their past is not usable because of the ethnographic view of the state, or are there other reasons? Which was what I was wanting to. Is it primarily the ethnographic? Because
I think at least it often is like that there's a very, very particular sort of demand of the performance of group identity by the state for specific kinds of recognition, right? And And there are hints of this in the Jewish question too, right? And that problem as in the colonial context then gets amplified precisely because of the specifically ethnographic structure of the colonial state.
Right. So I think that's the issue, especially now when you bring in colonial states. There's an added element of othering that goes on there, right? And so I think it raises a very interesting question for Marxism, right? Which is, and on the Jewish question, Marx's answer to that is, okay, well then we get rid of a lot of these. We don't need these religions, right? But is that going to be really, do we want to sort of modify that is the question? Because do we want to think about, because then what are we doing with identity? I mean, I know this just because the Jewish Marxists are often talking about this, right? Wait a second, but Judaism is not just a religion, right? So then, but what about all these? But you could say that about a lot of these identities, right? So then what do how do you then rethink the state or any other political structure? I think that's really the heart of the question, for which I don't have a simple answer. But how do we rethink it in such a way that it is able to contain these particularities, right? I think, or even nourish these particularities, right? Yeah, but thanks. I know that was not quite an answer, but.
Great. Okay, one last question from Anusha.
Hi, thank you. I feel a lot of pressure being the last question, so hopefully it'll come across. Thank you so much. Yeah, a lot of this was wonderful, and I'm trying to weave things together in my head. It's not my area of expertise completely, although I do draw on some Marxist theories for my work, but I wanted to ask more about the relationship between caste and romantic anti-capitalism. You touched on it, and you were talking a bit about how some of the people that you're drawing on are thinking about caste in relation to that. I just wanted to ask for my own clarification. I didn't quite see the connection, and I was thinking specifically about the quote from Jnani, thinking about no private property and people who worked for what they needed. But yes, that relied on caste labor and caste hierarchies in order for that to happen. And so I guess this is kind of touching on Nandini's question and Mekola's question about like what kind of past and are these romantic anti-capitalists kind of drawing on, and where does caste fit into that? And then the part B to that question is thinking about where do you think the possibilities for the annihilation of caste in a romantic anti-capitalist kind of worldview or project, is there a possibility for that, and how, in terms of like, if I understand correctly what you're talking about, that capital wants to reduce labor, but also sees labor as the only source of value. If anti-capitalism, then how is anti-capitalism then thinking about labor in ways, labor and laborers, to go back to Shankar's question, how is it thinking about both labor and laborers in a way that might either open up or foreclose the possibility for the annihilation of caste? So yeah, like part A, thinking about like, how are these thinkers thinking about caste, and then your views on whether annihilation of caste is a kind of project that's possible or not within this romantic anti-capitalism.
Yeah, thanks. Those are helpful questions. I would, let me take them in turn, and I think they're sort of related. Or maybe let me do the second one first, just because that requires a little clarification, something that I didn't clarify in the talk. So I mentioned these two Marxist kind of theories of transition, if you will, right? So the first one was based on technology, and that's the one I think you referred to, where that capitalism goes in, it pulls in. It's from really the Grundrisse and the fragment on machines, right? Where Marx talks about these two tendencies that capitalism has, right? Where on the one hand you have increasing technological mediation, and and so therefore labor becomes obsolete. But on the other hand, capital keeps positing labor, right? So that we still, as long as society is capitalist, we constantly have to sell our labor power to get money and get use values, right? But in my reading, that's not the most romantic reading of Marx. In fact, that group would actually be against romantic anti-capitalism. In fact, they would claim precisely, they would stress I think with some people, Prem and others, or the reading of Ambedkar, that there's a break, that we can't go back anymore. So if you make that move, then it's going to be much more difficult to be a kind of romantic anti-capitalist, because any kind of attempt to talk about identity is actually a reconstruction. So then your politics of caste, so coming to the first question, is going to be a little bit different, because it's going to be okay, and I just don't know enough about the Ambedkar to really to make the argument in his terms, but definitely on what Prem is saying is that okay, then what we're going to do is reconstruct everything at the moment, right? We're not going to be going to draw on the past, right? And that's going to be the move. So how you talk about caste is going to be different. You might still we might all support the same caste movements or anti-caste movements, but the question is, what do you do afterwards? Now, the other view of Marxism that I was talking about, which draws more on the Vera Zasilic letters, right? So where you talk about the attempt, the pre-capitalist coming into the capitalist, that it's never completely gone, right? So that's almost another vision of time. It's not a break. The break can never completely happen. It always gets reconstituted. There's always something from the past coming in. Well, then what anti-caste movements or indigenous movements are going to do is also going to try to see, well, what can be kind of, sort of preserved from this, right? And this gets to from these older structures that could then help us envision a new future, right? So and so, like a lot of the questions right today about, well, what does it mean for gender? What does it mean? Well, what are there resources that we can then draw on, I guess is the question. So that's where I think the caste politics is going to the relationship between a caste politics and the past is going to be different, right? I think that's going to be. Does that get to you to the question?
Yeah, I will. Yeah, I'll take all that in. Thank you.
Thanks.
I guess we should start wrapping up. I think your talk was so important, Viren, partly because this romantic anti-capitalism is so alive and well, like virtually the entire field of Sanskrit literary studies. That's what it is. And I've tried to tell that to the field with mild criticisms and telling them that basically all you have to do is avow it and take responsibility for it, and then we can all move forward. But if we say that a Sanskrit poem defies every category that we've ever been able to conceive of, and if we truly understand the text, then we'll be able to float off into heaven. That's obviously...
Well, I should have learned Sanskrit.
No way. You're coming to Sanskrit. You're coming home to Sanskrit. Well, thank you so much. Please, on behalf of everyone, or actually I should say everyone, join me in thanking Viren for what was really an extraordinary talk. Really wonderful. I really appreciated it.
Thank you. Thank you all.